Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. With elections just around the corner, there's a lot of attention being paid to the Mexican electoral system and whether it's vulnerable to manipulation. There's a lot at stake in these elections, not just who will run the country for the next 6 years, but the course Mexico will take. How can Mexicans assure respect for the popular vote in this critical context? To talk about this issue, we're very fortunate to have with us Professor John Ackerman. John, thank you for being with us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Great privilege and honor.
John is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a professor at the Institute for Legal Studies. John, I wanted to ask you right off, you have said that there's a major risk for democracy in these elections. Why?
Well, I would even say my last book was called The Myth of Democratic Transition. So I would even call today Mexico authoritarian system. So it's not so much that there's a risk to democracy, it's more like the risk is that the authoritarian structures will remain in place. The hope, to the contrary, the hope is that this election might be our first really democratic election in decades in Mexico. It won't be easy, but I think it might be possible.
So what's at stake here is really a democratic transition.
Exactly. The thing is that the year 2000, we were sold this myth, this fantasy that somehow just because the PRI had lost the presidency and the opposition had won, Vicente Fox, ex-Coca-Cola executive, running on the PAN ticket, the Christian Democratic right-wing ticket, he came in the year 2000. But when you actually look at the historical record, this was more of a pacted, extra-electoral, behind-the-scenes pacted transition. Fox, when he arrives, governs with the PRI, continues the same authoritarian structures. Then with Calderón in 2006, 2012, things getting worse. And then the return of Peña Nieto in 2012 is sort of, the cherry on the top of the lack of transition, the thing that most clearly demonstrates to us that we never ever moved anywhere, because Peña Nieto represents the old PRI, and we still have the same authoritarian system. We've held alternation in power, but we don't have an actual transition.
Well, what are the specific risks in the process itself? Now, you have this authoritarian system that has not been abolished, clearly, and yet you have these new electoral institutes, and you have an election where there's a real challenge to that system. So what kind of specific risks are you seeing?
Well, in Mexico, there is still electoral fraud. That's what people need to understand, because we have these, very sophisticated laws, institutions, electoral authorities, electoral tribunal, alternation in power. So people imagine that Mexico somehow is this normal democracy now, but it's not. Fraud is very much a clear and present danger, if you want to put it that way. Just last year, in 2017, in the state of Mexico and in Coahuila, two key state elections, the PRI won by fraud. The cousin of Enrique Peña Nieto, the president of Mexico, his cousin, Alfredo del Mazo, won supposedly by 2-3 percentage points, but the amount of irregularities around that election in the state of Mexico, for instance, are enormous. Everything from vote buying, vast vote buying, violation of the secrecy of vote. It's not just that they offer money so that people promise to go and vote, but they actually ask for proof. So you're taking a picture with your cell phone of your vote. In exchange for that, you get 500, 1,000, up to 2,000 pesos. Children are sent with the voters to look over their shoulders to see how they vote. There's this sophisticated system of asking voters to go. The first voter goes and pretends he votes, or she brings back a blank ballot. That blank ballot is then handed over to the political boss, checked off for the PRI. That ballot already filled out is given to the next voter. That voter goes in, places that ballot, and returns with a blank ballot. So you have a systematic violation of the freedom of votes. And then also in the counting of the votes, people think that at least in that point, the Mexican system is clean. But not even there. There are some very serious irregularities, both in the state of Mexico and Coahuila, of just the tallying up of the votes itself.
The counting, and we've seen in past cases also fraud committed in the reporting of the votes. You know, this runs counter to an image that much of the international community has, that Mexico has made advances and that it is, in fact, a democratic society. How's it possible that Mexico has maintained this image when there is so much evidence? And how have these elections in which fraud has been detected, how have they remained in place?
Well, Mexico is perhaps the country with greatest experience and expertise at simulation, right?
It's a word we hear often here.
Right, it's this magical realism, if you want to put it in a more literary sense, right? So everything seems kind of okay on the surface, but when you actually look underneath, you see that it's incredibly sophisticated, the networks of corruption and of fraud, right? So the image given to the international community is, we have these laws, which are good. The laws are on the books, are excellent. These well-funded institutions. There's this generalized hypocrisy in foreign relations developed through decades of experience of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, and these are generally taken at face value by the international press. But when you actually look at things, things are, so for instance, look at Odebrecht. It's a great example, which has been covered by the international press, and which in most countries, something has happened. Right? In Peru, the president just had to step down. Brazil, all over South America and Latin America, there's been some sort of consequence. While in Mexico...
And they know they've been involved in Mexico.
Exactly, they have been involved in Mexico. So, Emilio Lozoya, who was the head of the petroleum, the state Pemex oil institution in Mexico, was previously the head of Enrique Peña Nieto's foreign affairs in his campaign, the presidential campaign in 2012. Well, the accusations are that he received $4 million during the campaign, which were then, one would imagine, used to buy votes, right? The federal prosecutor, who was responsible for the electoral crimes prosecutor, who just opened up a file on Lozoya, and 2 weeks later was fired in September. And so we don't even have we have all these laws, but in fact they're not applied. And just a couple weeks ago, also Cesar Duarte, another electoral criminal who's been accused of serious crimes by the New York Times itself,
with a great deal of evidence,
millions and millions of pesos being used in the most recent elections in Chihuahua in 2015. It would be. Has also just been, the case has just been closed on him, and it's been, and he's hiding out in Texas. So,
well, that's certainly the history of corruption here. In the case of the elections, in particular, Mexico has one of the most expensive election systems in the world. A lot of public resources that go in there, and years now of trying to build up the National Electoral Institute. Do you think that institute now can be any kind of guarantee against this type of fraud?
Well, the idea of the Mexican electorate being expensive is relative, because in terms of public monies, yes, there's a lot of public investment. But actually, in the United States, for instance, the elections are a lot more expensive. It's just that it's private money, right? And so people somehow don't care about that sometimes. In Mexico, we have a very public-directed system, which I think is actually excellent. Only 10% of the funding can come from the private, theoretically. Of course, money comes in, but only 10% officially by law can be used by each one of the candidates. It's completely public funded. There's public guaranteed advertising. You can't purchase any advertising time on television or radio. So it's actually an excellent system. It would seem like a good
framework.
The problem is that it's not enforced, as so many other things in Mexican Constitution and Mexican laws. And one of the big problems are precisely the people who are in charge of the Electoral Institute and the Federal Electoral Tribunal.
Well, when you say it's not enforced, you mean the Electoral Institute violates its own rules and laws?
Or promotes the violation of its own laws. Yes, exactly.
Or accepts
Our Electoral Institute is chock full of political appointees, and the Electoral Tribunal as well. And so they really operate in favor of impunity. And the most recent case, so Felipe Calderon's wife, Margarita Zavala, wants to be president. She was kicked out of her party, or she quit her own party, the PAN, so she spent the last 6 months trying to set up her independent candidacy. And she has very little actual support. But magically, apparently she just got over the brink of the 867,000 signatures she needed to come onto the ballot. And the Electoral Institute is just sort of pretending they don't see all the incredible irregularities in the way in which that list of signatures was set up through, most likely, this is a speculation, but most likely through trafficking and personal information.
What can citizens do then? What can Mexico do to bring that back on course and make sure that the Institute operates in an institutional way?
Well, I don't know if the Institute itself is ever going to operate in an institutional way, but there is lots we can do from society. I think that's the great news and the great hope for this election, is that Mexican civil society is actually very aware, very conscious, and very participative. I don't agree with, there's many people, Mexican scholars or Mexicanists in the United States often say, well, the Mexican civil society is very passive if you compare it to Argentina or Brazil, which they take the streets. This isn't true. Mexico, it's a different kind of activism, but we're constantly in the streets, we're constantly protesting, and we're very much aware of what's going on. If you look at the Latin barometer studies, for instance, Mexico is at the bottom of the barrel in terms of confidence in public institutions or satisfaction with democracy. This I see as positive. Only 17% of Mexicans are satisfied with their democracy. Traditional political scientists say, oh, they have a problem of the culture of legality. They don't trust their institutions. But I see it the other way around. This means that 83% of the Mexican population have their eyes open, are aware that this is not democracy, and they demand more.
That the institutions aren't trustworthy.
Exactly, they're not trustworthy. Why are we going to trust these guys who are not trustworthy? So the citizens have been very participative. In the 90s, for instance, their first democratic elections in 1997 and 2000, there was a great activism through, for instance, Alianza Cívica. There was a lot of participation nationally, internationally, as electoral observers. This is in the law. In recent years, there hasn't been much interest in this. People have been very cynical and depressed. Well, they're going to do fraud anyway. The hope is that now in 2018, the citizens, Mexican citizens, and the international community in general, there's a whole system for registering international observers, will actually become much more active, and that we might be able to, as citizens, stop the fraud or intents, the purposes of fraud that some actors in Mexican society are trying to implement.
And you're very involved in the formation of a new University and Citizens Network for Democracy that came out of a seminar organized by a new initiative at the university called Diálogos para la Democracia. Tell us about what that initiative plans to do.
Thanks, Larry. You're also a key part of this network. It's just being born, and it's an exciting experience. Precisely in February, from the UNAM, we organized an international conference on democracy and authoritarianism in Mexico and in the world. But instead of just talking to each other and analyzing, academically this situation, we also got together and met and had a workshop between the participants in the conference, and between all of us decided to go beyond just theory and move to practice and try to do something about stopping the consolidation of authoritarianism in 2018 and try to actually push forward democracy in Mexico. So we just last week announced this publicly. We'd have 180 original founder signatories, how would you say it in English, including great international figures like Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Noam Chomsky, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Roberto Gargarella. We have a great international network, and 13 countries, a dozen different states in Mexico too. It's not just a Chilango network, it's trying to be a nationwide thing. And the next steps are to try to actually organize ourselves and get as many observers, both Mexicans and internationals, into the field on July 1st.
So one of the main purposes of this network is the organization of international and national observers. What exactly do observers do, and why are they so important to spread out and cover the maximum number of polling places?
Well, there are different stages. The observation actually needs to start before. Just this Friday, 30th of March, the campaigns began. And the irregularities, like we're saying, in terms of vote buying, that's not something that only happens the day of the election, but from the months beforehand. So, for instance, the government starts to put pressure on people who receive subsidies, right? Single mothers, for instance, particularly the most vulnerable communities, poor communities, single mothers, students receive scholarships from the government to be able to, social programs. And the government starts to apply pressure on those people saying, well, you're going to lose your scholarship if you don't vote for the PRI. And then on the other hand, here we go, we will offer you 1,000 pesos if you send us that picture, right? So that all starts getting set up beforehand. And this international network can play an important role, I think, to expose this, to make it transparent, to have people denounce and report this stuff. They could do it anonymously, and then we can make it public and put pressure on the electoral institutions to stop this stuff.
There's a mechanism set up, isn't there, for reporting, for citizen reporting of electoral dirty tricks? What kind of reports are you getting?
Well, we're just setting up now, so we're hoping to get a lot. But in previous elections where we've done similar kind of initiatives, there's a whole wide range of stuff. So for instance, one thing actually, just last week did come in is, for instance, a report on taxi drivers or drivers of public transportation being forced to put stickers on their unidades, on their vehicles, promoting Meade, who is the pre-official government candidate. This is illegal, of course. I mean, you can put political advertisements on your stuff.
Is there an implicit threat there that they'll lose their license?
That they'll lose their license, that they'll be kicked out of the union which controls the taxis in this particular location, or the peseros in this particular location. So that's something that happened in the state of Mexico as well.
Coercion.
Of course, that's a real coercion
their
over
livelihoods. Yeah.
And so, and the use of these social programs is terrible. There's on the books in the Mexican law, once again it's good, there's a prohibition against the celebration of public, of any kind of publicity given to government programs during these 3 months of the campaign. But the government tries to get around it by not making a public announcement, but what they do is they convoke, invite, make a big invitation to all of the people who receive government programs in a particular community. Say, this day you have to come to get your tarjeta, your card, or you're going to get a special benefit like a computer or just a canasta de frijoles and any kind of basic foodstuffs. And then after that government event, they are shuffled over to a political meeting of a pre-candidate, right?
And people forget how much poverty and extreme poverty exists in Mexico. And after years of authoritarian rule, a lot of people still feel that it's better to have the beans and the rice than the vote.
Right, well, they might be aware that this is just a short-term benefit for a long-term suffering, but the structures of clientelistic control are still very, very strong. And so the threats are real. I mean, they really, even if they can't even look at the ballot, what is public, it has to be public by laws, for instance, how a community voted in the particular casilla. That voting booth has to publicize its results. That's part of the process, because we all want to know how the people vote in that community. So if that community votes against the status quo, the entire community can be punished, with just a cancellation of all their social programs. And so when you look at the demographic data, actually the PRI, which is the ruling party, which is the neoliberal party, actually its voting base are the poorest people in Mexico. López Obrador,
rural Mexico in large part.
López Obrador, who's the leading candidate in the polls, actually is strongest in urban, middle class youth, people who are have a little bit more of independence from these clientelistic networks. But people sometimes think of it the opposite, because they think of López Obrador as the populist, right, and the PRI as the modern neoliberal. But actually, if you look at the voting base, it's exactly the opposite.
In this effort, when you receive the complaints, then will you be documenting them to present to the Electoral Institute? Because in the past, I know it's been hard to document all the kinds of complaints that come in.
Yeah, we have a whole team of lawyers who are going to be, on the one hand, giving advice to people who are victims or witnesses of electoral crimes, so that they themselves can present the cases to the authorities. That's the best case, because that's, the actual witness is bringing the information. That's much more likely to be successful. But on the other hand, if they just want to come share anonymous information, we're going to be putting that together and creating weekly, monthly reports on the irregularities information we're getting, and we'll be handing them over to the authorities and trying to pressure them to actually do something about it.
And this form of anonymous reporting is important because we also know that these are elections that could be, and in fact already are, plagued by violence in certain areas.
Yeah, that's a big concern, because Mexico is one of the most violent countries in the world, particularly in specific cities and regions. And that's a big question, whether the networks of organized crime, which are not just in society, but which are very much imbricated with and linked to, government, politicians and government power, whether they're going to also play a card in this election.
Because their goal is to get someone elected who's going to let them operate freely.
Well, yeah. So far, the narcos, organized crime, have the real direct electoral violence, political violence, has been exercised more at the local level, right? Candidates for municipal presidency. So, for instance, what the narcos are particularly interested in is that they be able to appoint the head of public security for the municipalities through which their cargamentos, right, their drug shipments go through. Because if you have a local policeman who's looking out, that can create lots of problems. But they normally work at that level. At the federal level, it's more through money, and so they might be playing on one side or the other, trying to fund these vote buying operations. We'll see what happens.
You talked about the role of the observers in pre-election, which is very important, especially in this particular case of Mexico and the previous types of fraud that we've seen in elections. So on the day of the elections, what do they do?
On the day of the elections is very important as well, because there are still serious problems with how the votes are counted.
Yeah, we mentioned some of those.
In the state of Mexico, for instance, just sort of, we didn't have a whole systematic study of it. A similar group of academics, intellectuals did an observation in the state of Mexico. One thing we discovered, for instance, in a couple of the districts we looked at, were that hundreds of ballot boxes didn't actually arrive at the district offices. So you have the voting centers, then the boxes with the ballots have to be brought to the district centers the very night of the election. Hundreds of them didn't actually arrive until the next day at like 8 or 9 in the morning. They were sort of, hanging out, these boxes, in the middle of the night in someone's house. Were they being manipulated, changed? I don't know. The problem is that their citizens are randomly selected to count up the votes and to hand them over to the authorities. The problem is that when you have communities which are so much controlled by these corporativist and clientelistic networks, they may be citizens, but they may also be citizens who are vulnerable to these kinds of pressures. And so we can get ballot box stuffing, we can get funny counting, that happens. And if you have an observer, an international observer, who's just, observers can only do that. They can observe, they can't actually intervene. But that's a significant pressure on these guys, because these are crimes. I mean, if they are caught doing funny counting, they can go to jail for a few years. And so just having someone looking at them makes a big difference.
International observers and national observers are very important to monitor the process. What else could you say about the role of the international community?
Well, there's a very important international media bias as well. The international media, particularly the financial media like The Economist, Wall Street Journal, tend to use sort of fear tactics to create an international public opinion current against López Obrador in particular, right? López Obrador is painted as a populist, as a radical, as a firebrand, as intolerant, as anti-institutional, without any kind of real backup or support for those kinds of adjectives. López Obrador himself the closest example for him in Latin America for me is Jose Mujica in Uruguay, someone whose basic image is being humble, being austere, anti-corruption, sort of fatherly figure. Bernie Sanders would be similar. For better or for worse, López Obrador is not similar. I wouldn't even say to Lula, nor to Chavez, nor to Evo Morales. He's his own phenomenon, but this international press is trying to create this hysteria, and so that's the other side.
So there's a big challenge to try to balance out the media coverage
and stop U.S. interventionism. Yes, there you go. That's because all this international opinion, bias is designed also and has the effect of trying to get the United States involved to stop, populism in Mexico,
which does have some precedents in this country
and others. We have Honduras,
like
recently. We've decades, centuries of U.S. interventionism in its backyard of Latin America, and there's a real risk. Now with Bolton, who's the new national security advisor.
We've got a more hawkish
the new Secretary of State is going to be this guy from the CIA. There's a real risk that the United States will try to get more involved in the Mexican elections, calling it democracy promotion, but in the end, trying to stop politically someone like López Obrador, whose central plank is not expropriations or radical change, social change, but reconstructing institutions, combating corruption, and putting Mexico back on a basic stable playing field.
Well, there's a huge task in front of us, both on the national and international level, for respect for the popular vote. We're very glad to have your expertise on this critical issue. Thank you, John Ackerman.
Thank you, Laura. It's a wonderful pleasure.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.